Thank you for sticking around on such a beautiful day. You choose to come into a lecture theatre, even one as nice as this, and listen to me. I'm slightly humbled by that. I'm going to talk about big data analytics. I'm going to touch on a few areas around the compliance aspects, some of the security points. There is a limit as to how much of the detail I can go into, and I'm quite grateful that some of the previous presentations have been quite technical, because it gives me a nice excuse to say mine is not going to be terribly technical, and we're just before a coffee break. I'm very conscious of that as well. My background, I've been working with NCC for 3 or so years now, and I've been working with various clients on a number of projects, many of which so far have only just begun to touch on big data, because for security aspects, it's still very much an emerging area. Any of you that work in the field will know that the CM deployments are only just getting to a position of maturity. So, big data analytics. What is big data? I like to try and define this problem and figure it out as the dynamically linked superset of multiple significant scale discrete data sets. That probably needs pulling out a little bit because it is a rather wordy quote from Oscar Wilde. Large volumes. We are not talking about the sort of stuff that people run on their SQL cluster at home. This is terabyte to exabyte scales as a minimum. One of the companies I worked with, they scaled up by 40 terabytes per day. Significant scale. It's the aggregation of lots of these data sets. There are multiple things that come together in ways that we hadn't necessarily thought of until someone said, have you tried connecting it with this? And they throw the two data sets together and suddenly find odd things come out. And it's the dynamic links between those. That is a key point. These are not the historical data sets that we've always looked at that are static. These are data sets that can change over time. So when you start introducing an analysis, the conclusion that it comes to today may not be the conclusion it gives you tomorrow. There's lots of strange mathematics in the background that goes into any serious analysis, which is extremely time-consuming for us to understand as an individual, but for the computer to run through and spit out a suggestion, it can come out with a very different one today to tomorrow. And you have to decide whether you are going to trust that analysis on the basis of we programmed it to do this, it's now come out with a different result, should we now trust that result? Or are you going to go, no, I'm going to be a bit skeptical about that. I don't know what has caused this to change, and is it a data quality issue? Why do we care? Why do we care about big data? It is a challenge. It does introduce significant costs. It's got all sorts of problems associated with it. Instead of running things in near real time, some of the tests, some of the sequences that you may want to run against this can take overnight to run and come back with a single result. So if you coded it incorrectly, your analysis may come back with something that's utterly of no use whatsoever. But once an organization has started to go through this, develop methods, and put this analytical skill in, then they can speed things up. They can leverage processing on data at scales that's unheard of. We can start to look at things which would, say, take a human genome and give a tailored chemotherapy. We can start to look at traffic patterns and improve transport scheduling. We can look at fraud systems and give really tailored results instead of having someone, as one of my colleagues had the other day, phoning up from the bank to say, your card's been rejected at your local supermarket. Because some of the traditional fraud systems are a little bit broad brush. Excuse me. But big data doesn't change some of the aspects. We still have the same people, and in a lot of situations, we still have the same controls. Some of the likelihoods of a breach, a data loss, an incident, are still exactly the same because of that. The difference is the scale of the breach you may get as a result. Instead of losing a floppy disk, a USB stick, which as bad as it may be, you can lose terabytes of data. If we're going to move to a position under the GDPR where they're going to put in structures of fines based on how much you've lost, that's going to get expensive. that 4%, they're going to have to put some justification behind it because it's going to be subject to legal challenge. But if you lose a big data set, that's going to start to look like a reasonable justification. If you lose it twice, yeah, they're going to start throwing books at people. The flip side of that is not just the regulatory points against big data, the customers often get a little bit freaked out by it. There are a couple of documented cases. My favorite one is the Target incident that happened in the US, where I think she was 16-year-old girl received a number of things about baby products, nappies, things like that. The father saw it, was outraged as to why Target would be sending her specific vouchers to get 25% off nappies. She's not even sexually active. He's going into the store and having a go at the manager. 2 weeks later, she finds out what has come through in the post and has to admit to her father that actually she has been seeing someone and has had an abortion. Her father would never have made this connection, and she would never have necessarily told him if it wasn't for the fact that Target had breached her privacy and sent this thing on what they thought was a brilliant move for the business, but actually resulted in one extremely annoyed customer who amazingly had the guts to go in and apologize to the store manager. I doubt that would happen in many cases. So we have to be very wary of, just because we can analyze this data and exploit it, should we? There has to be a fair amount of integrity from how you're going to use the data, leverage the conclusions, and decide as to whether there is a potential negative customer reputation impact just because you're trying to do this. Scale it back, think about making it a wider aspect. This also keys in towards the Data Protection Act and the GDPR aspects of don't look for individuals, look for statistical patterns. That's an easier situation. As we look at this, there is no best practice right now. There is no good way to do big data just yet because it's all so new. Everyone's changing their approaches. There's no right way to secure it. There's no right way to process it. There's no right way to exploit it. What we have seen is some of the failings. We've seen Snowden leak a terrific amount of information, and he is being very cautious about what he is leaking to the press as a result of that. It's a curious position. There's some very interesting ethical and integrity questions about that as to whether he's doing the right thing as Europeans or for the Americans. I know a number of people who worked in US intelligence, and they have very mixed views about him. The Panama Papers more recently have also shown that on the commercial side, for a legal firm where they have a very strong embedded culture of ensuring the confidentiality, putting Chinese walls in between systems, all that good stuff, can still fall down because people still choose to leak some of these things. It's almost as though it's the law of entropy actually applying itself to the more structure you put around the data, the more it wants to leak at times. If they struggle with it, can your organizations manage the confidentiality of a big data set? Do you have confidence that your staff are going to look after it, that your controls are going to sit there and keep the data in the right place, that it's going to be used for the right functions? Or are we going to see people abusing this and running personal analysis against big data sets just because they can? The results from some of the UK intelligence things basically were saying, I think it was last week, the guidance was, you can run analysis of this against yourself, but please don't. That doesn't sound like a very effective control. Compliance. GDPR and DPA both talk about you can use data for all sorts of purposes, but you have to have fair processing notices so that people, the data subjects, can understand what you are doing with the data that is about them. How are you going to define that if all you want to do is explore the data? Throw it around, jumble it up, and try and find what patterns come out. We're going to have to think a little more about the language that we're using in those, making sure that it is large enough that you don't have to go back repeatedly to ask for processing and fair processing authorization from the data subjects. but also restrictive enough that it is suitable for the regulator, that they will find it an acceptable point. The breaches are bigger. So the regulators, again, they're going to be forced to impose those fines against organizations as a result of the scale of the breach. They will be looking to see that all of this amazing technology that's been used to enable you to run the big data is also used in a similar way and with a similar level of intelligence to control it and make sure that the use of it is suitable. One of my colleagues, Gunter Ullman from NCC Domain Services, has described this series of key controls, which we feel introduce a series of options for you to try and ensure that you have overlapping points for the network, for the systems, for the user behavior, and for the data sets themselves to reduce the likelihood of loss. You're going to need to do the tracking. It's the same for the big data as it is for little data. We still need to know where it is, who's accessing it, what are they doing with it. As that moves around, we want to make sure that it's been encrypted, preferably before it even gets to you. There are plenty of ways that you can use hashing algorithms to identify unique data records rather than actually being able to see the record itself. That can help you to tokenize it effectively, similar to the PCI approach. Don't fall for the bamboo stick effect, where people would get car keys by sticking a hook on the end of a bamboo cane and grab your car keys through your letterbox. Make sure that the encryption keys are far enough away from the data sets that no bamboo stick can be long enough. I've seen organizations go as far as have big data in one cloud and the encryption keys in a different cloud provider with a connection that only is fired up on authorization to enforce that one. When you've got all of that logging together, make sure that it's actually checked. The logs that sit there are not going to be a reasonable deterrent, and they're not going to be any form of effective control that the regulator is going to care about if you have a breach. If you can't show that you've done something with those logs, they're as good as useless. They need to be parsed by a machine system, because there's no way any human can run through it, and then we're going to need some human level of review to ensure that we are capturing any anomalies. Continue your scanning. It's the very simple one. Automated scanning, PCI on a quarterly basis. Quarterly isn't going to be good enough for this. That's not going to be fast enough. Continuous scanning, daily, hourly may be required. Make sure that you're tracking exactly what there is. Look for any egress on your network system, any unusual spikes. There'll be really typical thing that goes off as traffic changes. But if we see odd spikes at times when the business is quiet and your data sets are not likely to be used, that's when we need to start flagging an alert. And put some false flags, some canary records into the system that you'll be able to track and should never be accessed by a standard user. When they go past, you can put the signatures into an IDS, and that'll help you spot an intruder. Getting back to how to actually use the big data analytics, what I've seen is different companies using it at different levels. There's the retrospective, where people are saying, okay, what happened? How did this incident come about? What are we going to report to the regulator? What are we going to report to the board? How do I tell the boss what's happened? We've also got the future-looking pieces. What is likely to happen? What do we think will happen if we do this? How can we influence that to change markets, behaviors, whatever it may be in the future? Depending on your organization, the maturity can step up and down, and there are various aspects around that. A key one is staff. Big data is less and less about technology. It's more about the analytics, the understanding, the information. The eye of the IT is far more important. Looking at the future analytics, and this is a somewhat terrifying example that connects back to the piece on Europol earlier on, predictive policing. A number of the American cities are now using a piece of software called Beware. Beware takes a report of a potential criminal incident, flags the address through a number of systems, in real time runs through to identify who is registered or who is likely to be at those addresses, and assigns them a red, amber, green threat rating. The makers haven't disclosed how it does this. They haven't said what sources it uses. It's reasonable to assume that it uses Twitter and other social networking feeds. The results of this can be that if you have been posting about post-traumatic stress, being unhappy with some aspects of your life, you may find that there is either a polite knock at the door from a police officer or a somewhat more aggressive approach. And the swatting bits we've seen in a few different areas of competitive gaming, bizarrely, is a terrifying concept of having a SWAT team bursting down your door. But now this is actually converting that to a methodology for policing. I don't feel entirely comfortable about this, especially when we think about how bad the security is on the likes of Facebook and Twitter. A terrifying example that one of my friends has given me. She is a primary school teacher. She teaches reception kids, 4 or so years old. They asked her if she was on Facebook with the view of them wanting to connect to her. Why there's 4-year-olds on Facebook wanting to connect is a slightly different matter, but I'll worry about that another day. Because when she said no, because of course the teachers are not supposed to be connecting to the students through Facebook, when she said no, the kids went off and created for her a profile. They took pictures from the school website to make a fake Facebook profile for her and advertised it. It got connections from other teachers. The kids turn up to school one day and delightedly show Miss this Facebook profile so she can now have friends on Facebook. And they give her their credentials. She is mortified by this, but has to be supportive for the children. But you can see how this could have gone wrong. If you don't have that digital footprint yourself, if you haven't got a Facebook account, a Twitter account, if someone goes in under your name, flagging it as your location in the bio, with a similar set of interests, and then starts posting about, I don't know, this morning, Munich, there was the attacker. If someone was to start retweeting those sort of things, and then use this police predictive behavioral thing, is that going to result in the soft knock on the door from the officer, or the boot that goes through the door with the heavy weaponry behind it? Terrifying. So how to do some of the big data points well? Excuse me. Firstly, don't connect 4-year-olds on Facebook. Big data really is not about technology. It's about thinking about how we're going to use this technology as a lever. How are we going to lever those data sets to give us better information, better intelligence, better analysis? These are specialist skills that, frankly, most of us in traditional IT don't have. We are often thinking about how can we scale this system. On a cloud-based approach, that does not matter. We need people who are thinking very much about the data management, people who are trained in analytics, statistical methods. And those aren't in great supply. There's very few companies that actually need that scale at the moment. So you're going to have to be prepared to hunt hard to recruit them and to retain them. But if you don't get them, all you've got is a big database. It doesn't magically give you any information. It just sits there costing you money on an Amazon cloud or something. Of all of those bits, they then flow through to one of the bits which in almost every government IT project we see always has a scuppering point: data quality. I haven't yet seen a single project that doesn't struggle with data quality to some degree. But if you're going to be throwing all sorts of large databases together and then going to the board saying that we can raise customer revenue on the basis of this analytics, but you've got garbage going in, guess what? Big data really doesn't change that garbage in, garbage out principle. If you are just throwing in the same rubbish quality of data, just with more data sets, it's still going to come out with questionable results at best, wrong at worst. So my final point really on that is that big data of itself is not the be-all and end-all. It's the prerequisite for figuring out how we're going to use that better. How are we going to get better analytics to better understand our markets, our positions? Do we want to better understand cancer? Do we want to better understand the migration patterns of various animals, the sun flipping around, all sorts of things? But of itself, it is not going to give you those answers. It's the intelligence and the analytics we apply to those. Points of contact, we'll share the slides later on. So the actual final point, and this is my experiment that I'm doing on this today. Started off with a quote from Oscar Wilde, which is not entirely true. If you're more astute, you may have spotted this. This is my experiment from today, to find out if Google, with all of their big data powers, I've set up a Google alert against this. As of last night, there was no flags. Google can't find this quote. If this quote gets attributed back to me or Oscar Wilde in a week, I'm going to be really amused to see what the results are. So, yep, that is it from me. Kept it short and sweet because I'm aware that there's coffee waiting for us outside. So, do we have time for questions? Or?
Some great insights there into what you can do and maybe some notes of caution as to what you shouldn't do.
Oscar Wilde quote from the period in which he was incarcerated?
I think it maybe have been a period where he found himself locked out of his Facebook account. I imagine so, yes. No silly games on Facebook.
It's a quick, serious question. Security-wise, is it often an afterthought? You have some good advice in there about tying your IDS to some, canary sort of.
Yep.
Do you see that actually happening, or is that more of you really should be doing this?
I have seen that happening in the companies that have better data management and better information security. It is not something that I've seen happening in a lot of scenarios. Commercially, it very rarely seems to happen unless you get into financial sectors. In the financial sector, I've seen it happen quite a lot, where I've seen them actually take it a step further and have multiple canary records in different data sets so they can judge how far they've been penetrated. And then instead of immediately trying to stop the penetration, they've then instead stepped back and gone, okay, we know this has been penetrated. We know that the attackers have got access to this network. We'll now inject some additional canary records to find out how much further they've got or if they're still there. And it gives them time to actually perform the investigation whilst they have their fingers in the pot, which is far easier for the law enforcement to then come along and achieve a good conviction.